Welcome to the Northeast Kingdom Voice. Today we have a distinguished guest, former longtime Vermont State Senator Vince Illuzzi. We are here today to talk about all the work he has done on the Newport waterfront. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Scott, and always enjoyed serving with you at the State House in Montpelier.
Right. As you know, we just celebrated the 100th 100th birthday of Newport, and you know, Newport's waterfront, it's come so far over the last I guess like 25 years, because a lot of people will remember the dilapidated buildings that lined the waterfront, the old boathouses, and I understand you actually played a key role in cleaning up the waterfront.
That's right, I did, and the way it started was that in the mid to late 90s, the Department of State Buildings sent out a request for proposals to build an office building to take the remaining state employees off Main Street and put them in a new building. And I said to myself, that is going to be the last nail in the coffin for downtown, because downtown was already struggling. And so as chairman of the Senate Institutions Committee, which, as you know, oversees all state buildings and all state lands and is in charge of construction projects, I put a stop to the RFP and then embarked on a 4-year journey to secure the political and financial support to develop the Newport State Office Building and Waterfront Improvement Project, which started where the gateway is and extended all the way to the corner near Pomerleau Park.
Right.
And I did it with the help of some folks that the names will be familiar to folks in this area. Howard Dean was governor. I convinced him that Newport had long been forgotten by the General Assembly. A lot of the money went to Burlington to upgrade its sewage treatment plant, and it went to Montpelier, and it went to Middlebury. Any place in the state where there was a significant city by historical standards had been taken care of, except Newport. So finally, I was in a position where I was chairman of the committee. We had available funding through the capital construction bill, and we had what I consider to be a real desperate need. Downtown Newport was really on its last leg. And so we...
In what decade was this, 1990s?
Mid-90s.
Right.
We actually dedicated the project in 2000, in the summer of 2000. Now, the other key players, Representative Bill Fife. The reason he was a key player was not only was he from Newport, but he was one of Ralph Wright's hockey team members. He was a Republican that voted with Ralph Wright. And the reason that was important was that Bill Fife was able to generate Ralph's support for the project. And although you didn't serve when Ralph was there, and I think he was a great speaker, nothing of significance happened without his blessing. So Bill Fife, representative from Newport, spoke to Ralph. Ralph owed Bill some favors, and they together worked with Representative Robert Wood of Brandon. And so we generated the support on the House side. I was able to generate the support on the Senate side. And then in my frequent meetings with Howard Dean, who really was a hands-on governor, I convinced him that it was really fair to do a project in Newport when they had spent tens of millions of dollars in other parts of the state. So that was the genesis of the project, trying to save Newport, trying to bring a fair share of state resources to the community. As you may remember, it was somewhat of a rodent-infested waterfront at that time. Dilapidated buildings. There was a garage where they would historically dump used car batteries into the water, and there really was no waterfront. One of the other major fights we had was with the boat house owners. There were dilapidated, fallen down boathouses. And we had to actually fight with the owners. And ultimately, Howard Dean and I had a meeting, and he said, look, they're on state land. It was filled land, filled by the railroad for railroad purposes only. And the public trust doctrine says you can't fill the state in and claim it as your own property. So Howard said, as far as I'm concerned, the boathouses are worth the value of scrap lumber. And I said, well, let's try to be a little more equitable about it. So we paid them basically what was the fair market value, and we gave them a permit to go and build a boathouse somewhere else on the lake where they could find suitable land. So we treated the boathouse owners much more fairly than they deserved. None of them had clear title to the property. And so we started the process. The Newport, Gary Hoadley and I, Gary used to work for the union in Montpelier, and I would commute with him sometimes. And we had to buy the fire department. The fire department was in an old cinder block building up near where the Gateway parking lot is now. And I remember we went to a fire department meeting one night, and Chief Peranto was there. And I think he thought we'd been drinking, because I walked in and said, we're going to buy your fire station and tear it down as part of a waterfront improvement project. And I don't know if they thought we were kidding or had been drinking or both. But in any event, we did buy the land. And then we built them at state expense a brand new fire station near the interstate access.
And you did, well, whoever designed it, I think they did a spectacular job. Instead of just having a cinder block building coming into town, I think it's and it's ideally located. Just but how did it get the Emory Hubbard State Office?
Well, in 1992, M. Hubbard was my campaign manager. And as you recall, back in those days, not only did I have political opponents, I had, several employees at the Barton Chronicle, which at that time had a significant presence in the county.
Right.
And they were, in one form or another, constantly either ignoring or anything good that I did, accentuating anything bad that I did. So M. Hubbard finally stood up to the plate, and he says, look.
And his role was what?
He was state treasurer.
Right.
And he finally said, look, this has got to stop. He lived in Barton, which is where the Chronicle was headquartered, and he said, I'm going to be your campaign manager, and I'm going to let people know, because he was in Montpelier with us every day. He said, I'm going to let people know that this has got to stop. So I said to myself, well, M really stood up for me when the chips were down. And so when the building was being designed, I suggested to my counterpart, Representative Robert Wood, that we name it after Treasurer, at that time former State Treasurer, M. Hubbard of Barton. And of course, Bob and I agreed, and then it was written into the capital construction bill that would be the name of the building.
So did he survive long enough to see the building that was named after him?
I don't recall that he did. I think he died in the late 90s.
Right. Then I see the parking lot is named after an esteemed resident, Forrester, the late Forrester, and comedian,
right.
Jersey Drown.
That's right. And the reason we named it after Jersey was that when the building was initially being designed, if you were on Main Street, the parking lot level was so high that it was difficult to really get a good view of the lake. And so he suggested repeatedly at different forums and letters. Back then, people wrote letters, made phone calls, something which doesn't really happen with any frequency now. And so he suggested that we lower the level of the parking lot so that it would give people a more panoramic view of the lake, and that was accomplished, and we thought that was a good deed on his part and recognized him for it.
Right. Now, we talked beforehand, before the show, and you hadn't heard this, but I've read one consideration is, this is just being bounced around at these many meetings, which I think we've had way too many meetings in Newport talking about his future and not enough doing. But one discussion's focused on transforming the office building into a hotel, and the state would then settle its workers probably still in the downtown region, but not
Right.
in such a prime location. Now, just not really knowing anything about that, what do you think about the general concept?
Well, it's not unprecedented. We did that in St. Albans around 2011, where we made the existing state office building available to a private for-profit entity and then built a separate building elsewhere. And it worked, and we were able to design a more efficient and better building to accommodate, security needs and the changing times that we now find in state employment, in the state workforce, and the threats and the demands on the employees. I'm not sure, I had the building here built as a condominium building. I'm not sure a lot of people know that. The city was concerned about losing what little tax revenue they were receiving from the rundown Ramble Shack buildings there. And so I said that the way to accomplish that would be to make it a condo building. So the state owns its piece of it, but the other sections are privately owned. So the
Right.
Community National Bank owns its building, and there's a few other privately owned sections of that building.
I suspect Needleman's must be one of the private owners.
I don't think so. I think they lease from the state.
Okay.
I don't know if it would be that much of a benefit to Newport, but it's designed as a state office building. I had it heated with wood. I was always a big fan of wood chips because it supported the local
Right.
economy. Loggers, truckers, we have a lot of open land in this area. That was a big fight with state buildings. They said, well, you're going to have wood chips blowing down Main Street, and which I didn't believe. They just didn't want to bother with it because it is a little more work intensive. But we do have a wood chip building there that's used in the dead of winter. The oil burners are used in the spring and fall, but in the winter we save a lot of money, particularly when oil was up to, $3.50, $3.75 a gallon several years ago, and it may go back again.
Right.
But the wood chips do support the local economy.
Occasionally I hear people make what I think to be absurd statements, but I respect everybody's opinion. There are people who look at that beautiful waterfront and the beautiful building and say, it destroyed Newport. Really?
Right.
Is because I have photos of the waterfront there.
Right.
And I don't know how anybody can conceive that building destroyed Main Street. And now look at, I recently had two guests on my show, two women who have been spearheaded the Wednesdays on the waterfront. The music, that's now attracting, that whole area is now, the boardwalk is now attracted up to 1,000 people
Right.
every Wednesday.
Right.
Because, you can't rely, I don't think we should rely on federal government, on state government or local government to always do the right thing, and they shouldn't always be helping us. We need to help ourselves.
Right.
And these two young women just came up with this idea, and it's become wildly popular. And,
Great.
And, while Newport has a lot of struggle ahead of it, there are just residents who are trying to step up to the plate. Sometimes it's not easy dealing with city government
Right.
and city regulations,
Right.
but there are people stepping forward.
Well, I can say about back in the late '90s, the mayor was Karen Zisselberger, and she was very supportive and actually worked with us very closely in generating support for the project, because there were people, similar pessimists and naysayers. They said, well, it's just going to be a building where people can go and get their welfare benefits. Well, that's not really true. It really added to the tax base. It provided a forum for the bank and other commercial activity downtown. It kept the state employees on Main Street instead of where they were going to build, which was a privately owned building next to the hospital over to the right as you face it. And that would have killed downtown. So I think we accomplished a number of objectives, all of which state government always talks about trying to implement, which was going to be completely ignored here in Newport. So we had at that time, we had a very supportive municipal government. They worked very closely with us. and they were all there for the dedication. I'm sorry to say that, there is no more communication. Now, very frankly, I'm not in the Senate anymore, so I wouldn't be expected to be communicated, but I just don't sense a link to all of that goodwill that was generated when we started that project.
So tell me, the centennial just took place. Did you take part in the centennial at all?
I did not. I was not invited. I was not notified. I was not asked for any input. And again, I think that suggests that there's something going on in the city of Newport different than what was a open, collegial attitude that I saw at work in the late 90s when we put that project together. Very frankly, if the current administration was in place in the late 90s when I was designing and securing funding for that project, I doubt it ever would have happened.
Yeah, I'm accused of going through life with rose-colored glasses, but I do believe if a point in time where we have leaders who, especially a new generation of leaders, as you know, we're not youngsters anymore.
Right.
And I think there's a time when young people be allowed and be voted into office because some of our ideas are outdated.
Oh, sure.
And sometimes it's we need more. I think we need to allow and I think any way we can to bring a new generation forward for Newport and the greater Northeast Kingdom's a good thing.
Right. Well, I think you can't exclude the older generation. I think you have to work together.
Right, that's why I'm saying bring them forward and work them in.
I just don't see that happening right now. It's almost like, what have you done for me today? Otherwise, get lost, which is kind of a sad or bad attitude.
No, it is, and it's kind because I think what the Northeast Kingdom, not only Newport, but the Northeast Kingdom need to realize is we have a great opportunity right now because the whole EB5 issue with the block and with Jay Peak,
right?
Suddenly we are in the attention of the media. I get interviewed or I get contacted to have from reporters who are looking for certain people to interview everywhere from the History Channel. One day I had the History Channel, all the major news networks. One day I was at home and I saw these two guys walking across my lawn. They Googled me. They were from the Daily Mail from England.
Sure.
And what I'm saying is, instead of sitting around wringing our hands, boo-hoo is us, we have to put, have you ever gotten anywhere wringing your hands and crying about?
No, and as we spoke about earlier, I think before we went on tape, I think Newport is in a better position today to redevelop downtown than it was before those dilapidated and really slum-like apartments were torn down. Now, as you know, it cost over $2 million.
Now we're talking about what we call now the hole in the ground.
Right, but the hole in the ground is, in my opinion, more valuable than what was there before. In fact, I think the tax assessment may have gone up. Right. The reason is those buildings were largely uninhabitable, even though people were renting there. They had asbestos in them. They were, over 100 years old, and there was nothing unique about them. Now, you'll note that when we designed the waterfront, I left the NEK building standing. It's the only building I left standing, and that was because it was a architecturally pleasant, structurally sound building. Right. And the rest of them, we got rid of them. There used to be a parts store there, an auto shop. It was just a mess. Right. And likewise, I think by getting rid of those slums, those dilapidated buildings on the opposite side of the waterfront, I think it's going to allow a developer to get a head start or a jump start without having to invest $2 to $3 million simply to prepare the site for construction.
I agree, because before they were torn down, people would come to me, but these are historic buildings. Not really. Maybe the one on the corner was
Right.
historic, but most of those buildings were old. They weren't historic.
Right.
It's like we're aging and we're getting old. We are not becoming, you and I are not becoming historic.
Right.
Just because something's getting old doesn't make it historic.
Right.
Those buildings have been retrofitted and changed so much over there wasn't really anything left
Yeah,
to the
there's no useful life to wire them for the current demands for internet and fire and safety. It just could not be done. And they were in very poor condition, inefficient, not insulated. So I think we have to thank the EB5 developers for cleaning out that section of town.
Yeah, and I think that's true, and I believe that Newport is positioned to be once again rise, but not what it was, because that's the Main Street of my youth of the 60s and 70s and early 80s. That's not going to return. That's not meant to happen. That Main Street USA has changed. But
Right.
there are businesses on Main Street that are doing well. You take the natural food store. You take Exy at the Thai restaurant, second to none.
Right.
They're doing well. Largo's. So there are businesses and that are doing well. But there seems to be a mindset. You know, we've got to. People have to think more positive.
Mm-hmm. Well, I thought that in 2000, when we dedicated that building, there was a lot of optimism about what could happen, what it would generate for other activity, but at least we stabilized
Right.
what was present. If we had taken all of the remaining state employees off Main Street, and they were on Main Street in
Right.
various buildings, and moved them to the hospital, I really think downtown Newport would have died. And there would have been nobody like me. I don't think a private investor would have come forward
Right.
because there was no reason to come forward. The return on investment would have been much better in other communities around Vermont or in other states. So it really took an anchor tenant, in this case the state of Vermont, to begin the process. We stabilized things, and I think some of the businesses that you've just mentioned have built on what we accomplished.
Absolutely, there's no doubt about it. All right, we only have a few more minutes left. What do you think, in the meantime, should happen with, as they call, the hole in the ground?
Well, I think there needs to be. I think if I had. I think some money has to be spent to visualize for individuals what is the potential for that site. And whether it's one big building, which would be similar to the state office building, and then different condominiums in it, or whether they should be separate, standalone. I'd have to give that some thought, but I think if you could find an architect or a planner or designer from who has worked in other communities that are similarly situated to Newport, they could start bringing some ideas forward, because there is a lot of potential there. And of course, the nexus across the street to the waterfront, and then of course from the waterfront to Magog. You know, if we could try to replicate in some way or shape what has happened in Magog, I think it would be a great nexus where we could have a very profitable and successful city here in Newport.
Right. I had the privilege of knowing Tony Pomelo for many years, which I'm sure you
Yes, I did.
have.
Big contributor to my campaign, I might add.
Right.
He used to say, "You're the kind of guy that gets things done, and that's the kind of guy I support." And he'd send me $2,000 every 2 years as a campaign contribution.
I had the privilege of interviewing him shortly before his passing. He came on my radio show, and he had actually, Tony was the eternal optimist,
Right.
but he'd almost lost hope in Newport because he just said there's been so many missteps, and he even said at that time that you couldn't give him the hole just because he doesn't. He just felt that it was going to cost too much to build there. But he also said he just didn't feel Newport at this point, as you've talked about, is ready
Right.
to do something out of the box.
Right. Well, I think what you need is an inclusive leadership mandate. I don't feel welcome by the current administration. I don't know if you feel welcome.
No, Centennial. I've published my history of Newport, and I wasn't welcomed onto the Centennial.
So here are two people who at some point have played some role
Right.
in the where Newport is today. I think you have to have people who are inclusive, are free to set aside whatever grudges are there and really work in the best interests of the city. Until that happens, you're going to have a small group who are simply going to isolate themselves and in the process isolate the city of Newport from prosperity down the road.
Well, if there's anything positive, Derby is flourishing.
Right.
Is all the business, much of the business now is centered along
Right.
the Derby Road, and I love the Derby Road. I live in Derby. I was born and raised in Newport. My heart, there's still, some people say, well, you've lived in Derby for 30 years now. Why are you so interested in the future of Newport? It was
Right.
where I grew up. It's where
Right.
generations of my family
Mm-hmm.
has lived. So while I love Derby, I love Derby is a progressive community. I still want to see Newport succeed, and every once in a while, I just feel like banging my head and giving up. But
Well, don't do that. I grew up in Barry. Barry went through a lot of the same issues that Newport has gone through. Downtown, essentially deserted by commerce, and it's coming back. So I think there's a resurgence, and you've just got to get on top of that wave and ride it. Don't miss the opportunity. That's my advice.
I will say this in closing is the one thing I've often thought is Newport as a almost border community. It's not quite a border community because Derby separates it from the border, but still it's almost a border. I still think we need to celebrate its border history, and we need to take advantage of this rich history we have here. We have so much to offer visitors if we would just
Right.
embrace the real history and not this history that we wished it was.
Right, exactly.
In talking about history, I want to give you a copy of my latest book. It's
Great.
called Newport Centennial, Voices from a Lakeside Community.
Yeah.
And you are not in this one.
That's all right.
But you're going to be in book 2.
All right.
Because about the waterfront. And I'm not sure exactly when book 2 is coming out, but book 1 has sold so rapidly, it's taken me off guard because
Yeah.
I think people really, and I think the sale of my book proves to me that people love Newport. People
Right.
love Newport who I think this book has gone like to 35 states so far.
Mhm.
It's because people want Newport to once again rise.
Yes.
And I put it, Vince, to a man who has done so much for the Northeast Kingdom, including Newport.
Well, thank you very much. I grew up in Barry, and a lot of the Italians from Barry used to like to come to Newport, and they used to come up here. They'd go ice fishing. They used to love to go ice fishing. I remember when I was a young man, actually a kid, coming with my father and my brother, and we'd have lunch at Frank's Steakhouse or the Miss Newport Diner, and we'd drive out on the lake, and just a lot of fond memories. And I'm glad that I was able to help, steer Newport in the right direction during my time in office. And I hope that
Right.
folks will pick up and move forward.
You mentioned how the folks in Barry loved coming up here. Well, let me tell you, they also loved coming up here during Prohibition. I interviewed, I don't know if you knew Mrs. Spinelli, kind of like she was a historian in Barry.
I didn't.
And Mrs. Spinelli, I interviewed her when she was almost 100,
Wow.
and she talked about the Italian community. There was a group of them who kept them well supplied.
I bet.
And they'd go up to Canada, and you being Italian ancestry, you're probably. I had never heard of this drink, so I'm sitting there with two people in their 90s. There was this other Italian gentleman, and they're plying me with grappa.
Grappa, that's right. That's
And,
right. It's a big Italian drink.
I'm going to tell you, though, it could probably take rust off nails. So, yeah. Well, thank you for coming on, and thank you for everything you've done for the city of Newport and the Northeast Kingdom.
And thank you for recording the history.
Right. Thank you. And thank you to the viewers for tuning in to another segment of the Northeast Kingdom Voice.